"Stay away from my husband, you homewrecker." The scream echoed through Elite Fitness Gym at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning. Victoria Lawrence stood in the middle of the weight room, pointing at me with shaking hands, her face red with rage. Around us, early morning gym goers stopped mid-workout to watch the scene unfolding. I stood frozen near the squat rack where I'd been training another client, my heart pounding, my face burning with humiliation. Victoria was one of my personal training clients, a wealthy woman in her 50s who'd hired me 6 months ago to help her get in shape. Her husband Richard was a successful commercial real estate developer, and I'd trained him exactly once at Victoria's request before declining to continue because of his inappropriate behavior. I saw the messages, Victoria continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the gym. "I know you've been texting my husband. I know you've been trying to seduce him. Well, it's not going to work. Richard and I have been married for 28 years, and I'm not letting some 20-something personal trainer destroy our marriage." Everyone was staring. My other clients, fellow trainers, gym management, random people on treadmills, all watching as I was publicly accused of being a home wrecker, as my professional reputation was destroyed in real time by a client who'd completely misunderstood the situation. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that her husband had been harassing me for months, that I documented everything, that the only messages between us were his unwanted advances and my professional rejections. But this wasn't the time or place for that conversation. Not with dozens of witnesses and Victoria too angry to hear anything I said. So I swallowed my pride and said quietly, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Lawrence. I'll resign immediately. I never meant to cause problems in your marriage." Victoria stared at me for a moment, seeming surprised that I wasn't fighting back or defending myself. Then she grabbed her gym bag and stormed out, leaving me standing in the middle of the weight room with every eye in the gym focused on me. What Victoria didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know as she left that gym feeling righteous and victorious, was that I had 6 months of documentation proving her husband had been sexually harassing me. Text messages, voicemails, witnesses to his inappropriate comments, and a detailed complaint I'd filed with gym management 3 weeks earlier. What she also didn't know was that her perfect marriage and her husband's stellar reputation were both built on lies. And I was about to expose every single one of them. Before we dive into how a personal trainer who was publicly humiliated and falsely accused of being a homewrecker systematically destroyed the reputation of the man who'd been harassing her and the wife who'd blamed the victim, I want to thank you for being part of this community. A community that believes women shouldn't be blamed for men's bad behavior, and that sometimes the only way to stop harassment is to expose it completely and publicly. If you've ever been harassed and then blamed for it, if you've watched powerful men avoid consequences while their victims are labeled as troublemakers, if you've been called a homewrecker for rejecting someone's advances, this story will resonate with you. Hit that subscribe button to join thousands who appreciate stories where documentation and patience prove more powerful than money and reputation. Now let's step into the world of a personal trainer whose professionalism was weaponized against her, whose silence was mistaken for complicity, and whose eventual exposure of the truth destroyed 2 people who richly deserved it. My name is Maya Santos, and I'm a 29-year-old certified personal trainer working in Los Angeles, California. I grew up in a working-class Filipino family in the San Fernando Valley, the daughter of a nurse and a mechanic who worked multiple jobs to give me and my siblings opportunities they never had. I discovered fitness early, using it as an escape from the stress of a household where money was always tight and arguments were frequent. By high school, I was spending every free hour at the local gym, learning from whoever would teach me, building strength and confidence that translated into every aspect of my life. After graduating from Cal State Northridge with a degree in kinesiology, I earned multiple certifications in personal training, nutrition coaching, and strength conditioning. I worked at several big box gyms before landing a position at Elite Fitness, an upscale gym in West Los Angeles that catered to wealthy clients willing to pay premium rates for personalized training. Elite Fitness was exactly the kind of place I'd been working toward. The facilities were immaculate, the clientele was affluent and motivated, and the compensation structure rewarded trainers who could attract and retain high-value clients. Within 2 years, I'd built a roster of 15 regular clients and was making more money than I'd ever imagined possible. Most of my clients were wonderful, dedicated people genuinely committed to improving their health and fitness, who valued my expertise and treated me with professional respect. But working with wealthy clients also meant occasionally dealing with people who thought money entitled them to cross professional boundaries. Richard Lawrence was exactly that type of client, though I didn't realize it immediately. His wife Victoria had hired me 6 months earlier for 3 sessions per week focused on strength training and weight loss. She was pleasant if somewhat entitled, the kind of client who expected extensive availability and personalized attention but was generally reasonable within those expectations. After training Victoria for 2 months, she asked if I'd also work with her husband Richard. "He needs to lose weight and get in shape," she explained. "His doctor says his cholesterol is too high and he's at risk for heart disease. But Richard hates gyms and won't stick with a program unless someone pushes him. Would you be willing to train him too?" I agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to add another high-paying client. Richard was 53, successful in commercial real estate, and accustomed to getting what he wanted through charm and money. Our first training session seemed normal enough. He was out of shape but motivated, asking good questions about fitness and nutrition, seemingly committed to improving his health. The second session was when things started to feel uncomfortable. Richard made comments about my appearance that crossed the line from friendly compliment to inappropriate attention. "You must have to fight off men constantly looking like that," he said while I was demonstrating an exercise. "Does your boyfriend appreciate how lucky he is?" I redirected professionally, steering the conversation back to his workout and his health goals. But throughout the session, Richard continued making comments that felt increasingly inappropriate. Observations about my body, questions about my dating life, suggestions that we should get coffee sometime to quote, discuss his fitness plan in a more relaxed setting, end quote. After that second session, I told Victoria that I didn't think training Richard was working out. I explained vaguely that our personalities didn't mesh well for trainer-client relationships and suggested she find him a male trainer instead. Victoria seemed confused but didn't push back, and I thought that was the end of my professional relationship with Richard Lawrence. I was wrong. Richard didn't accept my professional boundary as final. Instead, he started texting me, messages that began as questions about fitness but quickly became personal and inappropriate. He'd compliment my appearance in ways that felt predatory rather than professional. He'd suggest we should get together outside the gym. He'd make comments that had clear sexual undertones. I responded to the first few messages with firm professional boundaries. "Mr. Lawrence, I'm not available for training sessions or personal meetings outside my scheduled clients. If you need fitness guidance, I can recommend excellent male trainers." But Richard interpreted my professional responses as encouragement, sending more frequent and increasingly explicit messages. Within a month of declining to continue training him, I'd received over 40 text messages from Richard Lawrence. Some were ostensibly about fitness questions. Others were compliments about my appearance that made my skin crawl. A few were explicit suggestions about what we could do together if I'd just give him a chance. I documented everything, screenshots of every text message with timestamps. Voicemails he left that started professional but became inappropriately personal. Witnesses at the gym who'd seen him approach me during Victoria's training sessions to make comments or suggestions. I built a comprehensive file showing a pattern of sustained harassment from a client's husband who wouldn't accept professional rejection. 3 weeks before Victoria's public confrontation at the gym, I filed a formal harassment complaint with Elite Fitness Management. I provided them with all my documentation and explained that Richard Lawrence's behavior was creating a hostile work environment. I requested that management bar him from the gym and speak with Victoria about her husband's conduct. The gym's response was disappointing but predictable. Management was concerned about losing Victoria as a high-paying client. They suggested I was, quote, misinterpreting friendly interest as harassment, end quote, and advised me to simply avoid Richard when he visited the gym with Victoria. They took no action to address his behavior or protect me from continued harassment. So I continued training Victoria while avoiding her husband whenever possible, all while Richard kept texting me inappropriate messages and showing up at the gym hoping to corner me for conversations I didn't want to have. The situation was professionally stressful and personally violating, made worse by management's refusal to take my complaint seriously. Then Victoria apparently discovered text messages on Richard's phone. Without context, without asking me what was happening, without any attempt to understand the situation, she assumed I was trying to seduce her husband. She assumed the young, attractive personal trainer was a homewrecker rather than a harassment victim. And she decided to confront me publicly at the gym during my busiest morning shift. Standing in that weight room after Victoria's dramatic exit, I made a decision. I was done being professional, done being quiet, done protecting Richard Lawrence's reputation while mine was being destroyed. If Victoria wanted to believe her husband's lies about my supposed advances, she could learn the truth the hard way. And if elite fitness management wouldn't protect their employees from harassment, they could deal with the legal and public relations consequences of that failure. I finished my scheduled training sessions that morning, maintaining professionalism despite the stares and whispers from other gym members. Then I packed up my belongings, submitted my resignation to management effective immediately, and walked out of Elite Fitness for the last time. But I wasn't walking away defeated. I was walking away to prepare the systematic destruction of Richard Lawrence's reputation and Victoria Lawrence's perfect marriage. Over the next 3 days, I compiled everything I had documenting Richard's harassment. Screenshots of over 70 text messages spanning 4 months showing his persistent inappropriate contact. Voicemail recordings where his tone shifted from professional to predatory. Written statements from 3 gym employees who'd witnessed Richard approaching me during Victoria's sessions to make comments or request private meetings. My formal harassment complaint to gym management and their inadequate response. A detailed timeline showing that Richard's contact had been unwanted, persistent, and escalating despite my repeated professional rejections. I also hired an employment attorney specializing in sexual harassment cases. Patricia Chen was recommended by a friend who'd used her successfully in a workplace discrimination case. I met with Patricia in her downtown LA office and presented my complete documentation of Richard's harassment and Elite Fitness's failure to address it. Patricia reviewed everything methodically, asking detailed questions about specific incidents and my responses. When she finished, she looked at me seriously. You have an extremely strong case for sexual harassment and hostile work environment. The documentation is comprehensive and the timeline clearly shows unwanted persistent contact despite your professional boundaries. Elite Fitness's failure to act on your complaint is additional liability. She continued, but pursuing this case will be difficult. Richard Lawrence is wealthy and well-connected. Elite Fitness will fight to protect their reputation. You'll face people assuming you're lying or exaggerating or trying to get money from a wealthy man. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Victoria's public accusation, about being called a homewrecker in front of dozens of witnesses, about Richard Lawrence facing no consequences while I lost my job and reputation. I'm prepared, I said. I want him exposed. I want Elite Fitness held accountable. And I want everyone who assumed I was the problem to know the truth. Patricia smiled. Then let's destroy him. We filed a lawsuit against both Richard Lawrence and Elite Fitness 1 week after Victoria's confrontation. The complaint detailed Richard's harassment, Elite Fitness's failure to address my complaint, and the hostile work environment created by management's refusal to protect employees from client harassment. We requested substantial damages for emotional distress, lost wages, and reputational harm. We also sent a detailed letter to Victoria Lawrence with copies of all the text messages her husband had sent me, the voicemails, the witness statements, and the timeline showing his persistent harassment. The letter explained that I had never initiated contact with Richard, had repeatedly declined his advances professionally, and had filed a formal harassment complaint before being publicly accused of being a homewrecker. The letter concluded with an offer. Victoria could join our lawsuit against her husband and Elite Fitness, testifying about Richard's pattern of deception and harassment. Or she could defend him and watch as his behavior was exposed in court proceedings that would become public record. The response came faster than I expected. 2 days after receiving our letter, Victoria's attorney contacted Patricia requesting a meeting. Victoria wanted to talk, wanted to understand what had really happened, and was considering whether to support our case against her husband. We met at Patricia's office on a Friday afternoon. Victoria arrived looking nothing like the confident, rage-filled woman who'd confronted me at the gym. She was pale, her designer clothes hanging loosely as if she'd lost weight from stress. Her attorney, an older woman named Susan Reynolds, seemed to be providing both legal and emotional support. Victoria sat across from me in Patricia's conference room, staring at the table for a long moment before speaking. "I need to know the truth," she said quietly. "All of it. What really happened between you and Richard?" I walked her through everything. The initial training sessions where Richard's comments became inappropriate. My decision to stop training him and my professional explanation to her. Richard's escalating text messages and voicemails after I declined to continue. The witnesses who'd seen him approaching me during her sessions. My harassment complaint to gym management and their refusal to act. The months of dodging him while continuing to train her, trying to maintain professional boundaries while he kept pushing them. Victoria listened without interruption, her face showing the progression of emotions as she processed information that contradicted everything Richard had told her. When I finished, I slid copies of the documentation across the table. "You can verify all of this," I said. "The text messages are in his phone if he hasn't deleted them. The voicemails can be authenticated. The witnesses will testify. This isn't my word against his. It's comprehensive documentation against his lies." Victoria reviewed the messages, and I watched her face crumble as she read her husband's texts. The inappropriate compliments, the suggestions about meeting privately, the increasingly explicit propositions, message after message showing Richard pursuing someone half his age who'd repeatedly declined his advances. "He told me you were texting him," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "He said you'd been sending inappropriate messages, making advances, trying to seduce him. He showed me a few texts out of context and said he'd been trying to discourage you professionally but you wouldn't stop." I believed him completely. She looked at me directly. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I said at the gym, for how I humiliated you publicly, for assuming you were the problem when Richard was the one harassing you. I should have asked questions before attacking you. I should have looked at the full context instead of believing his selective version." The apology felt genuine, but it didn't erase the damage her false accusation had caused. "Your apology doesn't give me back my job or my reputation," I said. "Everyone at that gym thinks I'm a homewrecker because of what you said. My professional credibility is destroyed because you believed your husband's lies without asking for my side." "I know," Victoria whispered. "And I don't know how to fix that. But I want to help. I want to make this right somehow." Susan Reynolds, Victoria's attorney, leaned forward. "Mrs. Lawrence is prepared to testify in your lawsuit about Richard's pattern of deception and infidelity. She's discovered that you're not the first young woman he's harassed or pursued inappropriately. She's also prepared to file for divorce and support your case publicly, making clear that you were a victim of harassment rather than a willing participant in an affair." Patricia and I exchanged glances. This was better than we'd hoped. Victoria's testimony and public support would significantly strengthen our case and help restore my reputation. "There's something else you should know," Victoria continued. "This isn't the first time Richard has done this. I found evidence of at least 2 other affairs over the years, both with women who worked in service positions where he had power over them. A real estate agent who worked for his company. A restaurant manager at a place he frequented. Both younger women who he pursued persistently until they eventually gave in." She pulled out her phone and showed us messages she'd found. "Richard has a pattern. He targets young attractive women in service professions, uses his money and position to pressure them, and then lies to me about their supposed advances on him. I've been married to a serial harasser for 28 years and convinced myself his explanations were true because I didn't want to face what they revealed about him. The revelations kept coming. Victoria had hired a private investigator after our letter arrived, and he'd uncovered years of Richard's inappropriate behavior with women who worked for him or provided services he used. The pattern was consistent: persistent unwanted attention, abuse of power dynamics, lies to his wife blaming the women for his behavior. Over the next 2 hours, Victoria and I went from adversaries to unexpected allies. 2 women who'd been manipulated by the same man, who'd been positioned as enemies when we should have been supporting each other, who'd both suffered because Richard Lawrence thought his money and position made him untouchable. We developed a coordinated strategy. Victoria would file for divorce with maximum publicity, making clear that Richard's harassment and infidelity were the reasons. She would provide testimony in my lawsuit detailing his pattern of deception. She would make a public statement retracting her accusation against me and apologizing for attacking a harassment victim. Most importantly, Victoria would help expose Richard's behavior to his professional network and social circles, ensuring that his reputation was destroyed as thoroughly as he'd tried to destroy mine. The plan would cost Victoria her marriage and probably significant social standing among friends who might side with Richard. But she seemed determined, perhaps motivated by years of suspicions confirmed, or anger at being lied to repeatedly, or genuine remorse for how she'd treated me. "He made me the villain in your story," Victoria said as our meeting concluded. "He convinced me to attack you publicly, to humiliate you, to destroy your reputation, all to hide his own predatory behavior. I can't undo that damage completely, but I can make sure everyone knows the truth about who the real villain is." Over the next 6 weeks, Victoria and I became unlikely partners in the systematic exposure of Richard Lawrence's decades of harassment and infidelity. We met regularly, comparing notes, sharing information, and coordinating our strategies for maximum impact. Victoria's private investigator found the 2 women Richard had actually had affairs with, women who'd started as harassment victims like me but eventually succumbed to his persistent pressure. Both were willing to provide statements about Richard's behavior, about how he'd used his position and wealth to manipulate them, about the emotional and professional damage his pursuit had caused. We also connected with 3 other women who'd been harassed by Richard but hadn't gone beyond rejecting his advances. Each had similar stories: persistent unwanted contact, inappropriate comments, pressure to engage with him privately. And all had remained silent because they didn't think anyone would believe them against a wealthy, powerful man with a respected reputation. Together, these women represented a pattern of predatory behavior spanning over 15 years. Richard Lawrence wasn't a man who'd made a few mistakes. He was a serial harasser who'd systematically targeted young women in vulnerable professional positions, used his money and status to pursue them regardless of their consent, and then lied to his wife and others to protect his reputation. Patricia filed amended complaints adding these women's testimonies to our lawsuit. The case expanded from a single harassment claim to a pattern and practice lawsuit demonstrating systematic predatory behavior. Elite Fitness's liability also increased because management had received multiple complaints about Richard over the years and done nothing except protect a high-paying client's membership. The media discovered the case about 8 weeks after initial filing. A reporter from the Los Angeles Times contacted Patricia about the lawsuit, having heard rumors about a prominent real estate developer being sued by multiple women for harassment. Patricia provided background on the case, and the resulting article was devastating for Richard. "Real estate developer faces multiple harassment claims," was the headline. The article detailed our lawsuit, Victoria's divorce filing, and the pattern of predatory behavior toward young women in service professions. Richard's professional reputation in Los Angeles commercial real estate was destroyed overnight. Within days, business partners were distancing themselves from Richard. Real estate deals were falling apart as partners pulled out. Professional organizations were reviewing his memberships. And social circles that had once welcomed him were suddenly finding reasons to exclude him from events and gatherings. Victoria's divorce petition had become public record, and it was brutal. She'd listed infidelity, harassment, and fraud as grounds for divorce, with detailed exhibits showing Richard's pattern of deception. She'd requested full accounting of marital assets and discovery of any money Richard had spent on affairs or payoffs to keep women quiet. Most damaging was Victoria's public statement, released through her attorney and picked up by media covering the divorce. She apologized directly to me for the gym confrontation, explained that she'd been manipulated by Richard's lies, and expressed support for all the women who'd been harassed by her husband. The statement was clear, specific, and completely undermined Richard's attempt to paint himself as the victim of false accusations. Richard fought back initially with his own attorneys and public relations team. They tried to frame the lawsuit as a money grab by opportunistic women. They suggested Victoria was bitter about the divorce and manipulating evidence. They hinted that I'd been a willing participant who changed my story when things ended. But every defense they attempted crumbled against our documentation. Timestamps on text messages proved Richard had been pursuing me persistently over months. Voicemail recordings showed his tone shifting from professional to predatory. Witness statements confirmed he'd been approaching me at the gym despite my obvious discomfort. My formal harassment complaint to Elite Fitness, filed weeks before Victoria's confrontation, proved I'd been seeking protection rather than pursuing an affair. The case never went to trial. 4 months after filing, Richard's attorneys approached us about settlement discussions. His legal position was untenable, his reputation was destroyed, and continuing to fight would only mean more public exposure of his behavior during depositions and trial proceedings. The settlement negotiations revealed just how completely Richard's world had collapsed. His real estate business was failing as partners and clients fled. His marriage was ending with Victoria positioned to receive substantial assets in divorce. His social reputation was ruined among the circles that had once respected him. And he was facing potential liability to multiple women whose lives he'd damaged through his harassment. We negotiated from a position of strength. My settlement included substantial compensation for emotional distress, lost wages, and reputational harm. Richard was required to write a public apology acknowledging his harassment and taking full responsibility for his behavior. He was permanently banned from Elite Fitness and required to notify any future gyms about his prior harassment complaints. The other women who'd been harassed received settlements proportional to their specific experiences and damages. And Elite Fitness, faced with overwhelming evidence of their failure to protect employees from client harassment, settled for an amount that included my compensation plus changes to their harassment policies and mandatory training for all management staff. Victoria's divorce settlement was separate but equally devastating for Richard. She received the majority of marital assets, their family home, and ongoing spousal support. Richard's attempt to claim poverty was demolished by discovery showing substantial hidden assets and money he'd spent on pursuing women and covering up affairs. 6 months after Victoria's gym confrontation, I was financially secure from settlements, professionally vindicated by public acknowledgement that I'd been a harassment victim rather than a homewrecker, and working at a new gym that valued employee safety and took harassment complaints seriously. More importantly, I'd helped expose a predator who'd spent decades harassing young women and using his wealth and position to avoid consequences. Richard Lawrence went from respected real estate developer to cautionary tale about powerful men who thought money made them untouchable. The gym confrontation that had seemed like my professional death actually became the catalyst for exposing Richard's behavior and protecting future women from his harassment. Victoria's false accusation, painful as it was in the moment, ultimately forced both of us to confront truths we'd been avoiding. For me, it meant recognizing that staying silent about harassment, even for professional reasons, only protects harassers while leaving victims vulnerable. I should have gone public with Richard's behavior immediately rather than hoping Elite Fitness would handle it discreetly. For Victoria, it meant acknowledging that she'd spent years ignoring warning signs and believing convenient lies because facing the truth about her husband was too painful. Her willingness to blame me initially was rooted in decades of denial about who Richard really was. Our unlikely partnership transformed both our lives. Victoria rebuilt her identity separate from Richard, using her divorce settlement to fund a nonprofit supporting harassment victims in service industry jobs. She became an advocate for believing women when they report harassment, sharing her own story about how she'd failed to believe me initially and the damage that mistake caused. I eventually returned to personal training at a gym with strong anti-harassment policies and management that took employee safety seriously. I used my settlement money to complete additional certifications and eventually opened my own small training studio where I controlled the environment completely and could immediately address any inappropriate client behavior. The experience taught me important lessons about power, harassment, and the ways victims are often blamed while perpetrators avoid consequences. Richard Lawrence harassed me for months, but when his wife discovered evidence of contact between us, her immediate assumption was that I was seducing him rather than he was harassing me. That assumption, that young attractive women in service professions are always trying to seduce wealthy older men rather than doing their jobs professionally, is exactly what allows harassment to continue. It's what kept Victoria from questioning Richard's behavior for years. It's what made Elite Fitness dismiss my complaint as misinterpreted friendliness. And it's what made Victoria feel justified in publicly calling me a homewrecker without asking for my side of the story. Understanding these dynamics has made me a better advocate for other harassment victims. I volunteer with organizations that support women in service industries, helping them document harassment and navigate reporting processes. I speak at gyms and fitness conferences about creating safe workplaces and taking harassment complaints seriously. Most importantly, I share my story with other young women working in fitness, hospitality, and other service professions where clients sometimes mistake professional service for personal interest. I teach them to document everything, to report immediately, and to never feel obligated to protect harassers through silence. The Richard Lawrence case became somewhat famous in Los Angeles employment law circles. It's cited as an example of how comprehensive documentation can overcome power imbalances between victims and wealthy harassers. It's used in sexual harassment training to demonstrate patterns of predatory behavior and the importance of taking complaints seriously. For me, it represents transformation from victim to victor. From the humiliated personal trainer accused of being a homewrecker to the woman who exposed a serial harasser and helped multiple victims receive justice and compensation. From professional vulnerability to financial security and genuine safety in my work environment. Victoria and I maintain an unlikely friendship born from shared experience and mutual transformation. We meet occasionally for coffee, two women on opposite sides of harassment who became allies in pursuit of truth and justice. She's rebuilt her life with courage and purpose. I've rebuilt mine with security and advocacy. Richard Lawrence's fall was complete and public. His real estate business folded. His professional reputation is permanently destroyed. His social standing evaporated. And his name is now associated with harassment and predatory behavior rather than commercial real estate success. The man who thought his money and position made him untouchable discovered that documentation, determination, and the testimony of multiple victims can overcome even substantial wealth and professional power. The harasser who'd spent decades pursuing young women without consequences finally faced accountability because one victim refused to stay silent and one wife chose truth over protecting her marriage. If this story resonates with you, if you've been harassed and blamed for it, if you've watched powerful men avoid consequences while their victims are labeled as troublemakers or worse, remember that documentation is your weapon and patience is your strategy. Every inappropriate message should be screenshot. Every witness should be identified. Every complaint should be formal and documented. Hit that subscribe button to join our community that believes harassment victims deserve support rather than blame. Share this story with someone who's being harassed or who's struggling with whether to report. Leave a comment about your own experiences with workplace harassment or how you documented and reported it. Because the most dangerous harassers aren't the ones who grab or assault, obviously. They're the ones like Richard Lawrence who use charm, money, and position to pursue persistently, who manipulate situations to blame their victims, and who rely on societal assumptions that young attractive women in service jobs must be trying to seduce wealthy clients. Richard Lawrence harassed me for months and then convinced his wife to publicly call me a homewrecker. He thought destroying my reputation would protect his. Instead, it triggered the investigation and exposure that destroyed everything he'd built on decades of predatory behavior. The personal trainer he harassed ended up financially secure and professionally vindicated. The wife he lied to ended up divorced and committed to supporting other victims. And the powerful man who thought money made him untouchable ended up exposed, disgraced, and alone. That's justice. That's accountability. And that's why I tell this story. The transformation from humiliated harassment victim to financially secure advocate took time and effort beyond just winning the lawsuit. The months following Victoria's gym confrontation were some of the most difficult of my life, even as I was building the case that would eventually destroy Richard Lawrence. I'd lost my job at Elite Fitness, which meant losing my primary income and the client base I'd spent 2 years building. The public accusation of being a homewrecker followed me as I tried to find work at other gyms. Word spreads quickly in the Los Angeles fitness community, and gym managers were hesitant to hire someone who'd been at the center of a dramatic public confrontation. I applied to 12 different gyms in the weeks after leaving Elite Fitness. Most didn't respond at all. 3 called me for interviews, but their questions made clear they'd heard about the incident and weren't sure they believed my version of events. Only one gym, a small boutique facility in Santa Monica called Core Strength, took my explanation seriously and checked my references with former clients who vouched for my professionalism. The owner of Core Strength, a woman named Jennifer Park, had herself been harassed early in her fitness career. She understood the dynamics of powerful clients using their position to pressure young trainers. She reviewed my documentation of Richard's harassment and hired me immediately, though it reduced compensation since I was starting over without an established client base. Those first months at Core Strength were financially stressful. I'd gone from making over $80,000 annually at Elite Fitness to barely scraping together $30,000 at my new position. I had to move from my 1-bedroom apartment in West LA to a studio in a less expensive neighborhood. I sold my car and started taking public transportation to save money. I cut expenses everywhere I could while building my lawsuit and trying to rebuild my professional reputation. The financial stress was compounded by emotional strain. I was angry about the injustice of losing my job and income because I'd been harassed. I was anxious about whether the lawsuit would succeed or if Richard's wealth and lawyers would overwhelm my case. I was depressed about how quickly my carefully built career had been damaged by false accusations. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in workplace trauma and sexual harassment. Dr. Sarah Kim helped me process the violation of Richard's persistent unwanted contact, the betrayal of Elite Fitness management dismissing my complaint, and the humiliation of Victoria's public accusation. Therapy was expensive and I could barely afford it, but it was essential for maintaining my mental health during the legal process. Dr. Kim helped me understand that my anger was justified and healthy rather than something to suppress. She validated my feelings of violation and betrayal. She taught me coping strategies for managing anxiety about the lawsuit's outcome. And she helped me recognize that Richard's harassment and Elite Fitness's failure weren't reflections of my worth or professionalism but rather systemic problems with how powerful men are enabled and victims are blamed. The therapy also addressed my complicated feelings about Victoria. Part of me hated her for the gym confrontation and for believing Richard's lies without questioning them. But another part recognized that she was also a victim of Richard's manipulation, lied to for years about his affairs and harassment. Dr. Kim helped me hold both truths simultaneously. Victoria had harmed me significantly through her false accusation, and she had also been deceived and betrayed by her husband for decades. These nuanced feelings became important when Victoria reached out wanting to become allies. I had to work through justified anger about her public humiliation of me while recognizing that her testimony and support would be crucial for the lawsuit and for exposing Richard's pattern of behavior. It wasn't simple forgiveness or easy reconciliation. It was strategic partnership between two women who'd both been harmed by the same man in different ways. As the lawsuit progressed and Victoria and I developed our coordinated strategy, I learned more details about Richard's decades of predatory behavior that Victoria had been uncovering. The private investigator she'd hired found evidence of not just the two confirmed affairs but at least 5 other instances of Richard pursuing young women in service positions. One was a restaurant server at a place Richard frequented for business lunches. He'd left his business card with his personal cell number, texted her persistently asking her to meet him privately, and when she refused, he'd complained to restaurant management that her service was unprofessional, nearly costing her the job. Another was a real estate agent who'd worked at Richard's firm as an independent contractor. He'd pursued her aggressively, making her professional work environment uncomfortable with constant advances. When she'd tried to report his behavior, she'd been told that, quote, Richard was just being friendly and she should be flattered by his attention, end quote. She'd eventually left the firm rather than continue dealing with his harassment. A third was a yoga instructor at a studio Victoria had attended years earlier. Richard had shown up at the studio claiming he wanted to try yoga, but his real purpose was pursuing the instructor who'd taught Victoria's classes. The instructor had documented his inappropriate comments and requests for private sessions, but the studio management had protected Richard as a potential wealthy client rather than supporting their employee. Each story followed the same pattern. Richard identified a young attractive woman in a service profession where she had less power than him. He pursued her persistently despite clear professional boundaries. He used his money and position to pressure her into engaging with him. And when she refused or tried to report his behavior, he either lied to deflect blame or used his influence to damage her professionally. Victoria's discovery of this pattern was devastating for her personally. She'd been married to a serial predator for 28 years and convinced herself his occasional explanations about women supposedly pursuing him were true because she didn't want to confront the alternative. She'd blamed young women for her husband's behavior rather than holding him accountable because that narrative was easier to accept than recognizing who she'd actually married. The guilt Victoria felt about these revelations was substantial. Not just about me and the gym confrontation, but about all the women over the years whose reports she might have dismissed or whose situations she might have been able to address if she'd been willing to see the pattern. She talked about this guilt frequently in our conversations, processing her own complicity in enabling Richard's behavior through years of choosing to believe convenient lies. This guilt drove Victoria's determination to expose Richard completely and support all the women he'd harassed. It wasn't just about our lawsuit anymore. It was about ensuring Richard faced consequences for decades of predatory behavior and that all his victims received validation and justice. As we added more women's testimonies to the lawsuit and the pattern became undeniable, Richard's defense strategy shifted. His attorneys could no longer claim I was a single disgruntled woman making false accusations. They couldn't argue he was the victim of a seductress when multiple women had similar experiences spanning years. And they couldn't paint Victoria as a bitter ex-wife when she had extensive documentation proving Richard's lies and manipulation. Richard tried a different approach through back-channel communications. He had mutual acquaintances reach out to Victoria suggesting that if she withdrew her support from my lawsuit and agreed to a quiet divorce, he'd be generous with the settlement. He sent messages through his attorney implying that continuing to fight would damage both their reputations and it would be better for everyone if they resolved things privately. Victoria refused every overture. She'd moved past protecting Richard's reputation or her own social standing. She wanted truth and accountability more than she wanted money or the preservation of appearances. This determination made her a powerful ally in ways Richard hadn't anticipated. The media coverage of the case intensified as more details emerged. The Los Angeles Times reporter who'd written the initial article continued following the story, publishing updates as new women came forward and as Victoria's divorce proceedings revealed more evidence of Richard's deception. Other media outlets picked up the story. Local television stations covered developments. Legal bloggers discussed the case as an example of pattern and practice harassment litigation. Richard's attempts to control the narrative through his public relations team were futile against the overwhelming evidence. Every statement his representatives released was contradicted by documented facts. Every attempt to claim he was being unfairly persecuted was undermined by testimony from multiple credible women with detailed accounts of similar experiences. The Los Angeles commercial real estate community's response was swift and brutal. Richard's firm, which had once been successful and respected, lost clients rapidly as companies didn't want to be associated with someone facing multiple harassment allegations. Business partners who'd worked with Richard for years dissolved their relationships. Professional organizations revoked his memberships or asked him to resign quietly. Richard's social circle also abandoned him progressively. Couples who'd been friends with Richard and Victoria for years sided with Victoria once they understood the situation. Country club memberships were quietly terminated. Invitations to charity events and social gatherings stopped coming. The social infrastructure that had defined Richard's life for decades evaporated as his reputation for harassment became public knowledge. I watched this destruction unfold with complicated feelings. Part of me felt satisfaction seeing Richard face consequences after years of avoiding them. Part of me felt vindicated that the truth was being recognized and I was no longer viewed as a homewrecker. But part of me also felt exhausted by how long the process was taking and how much energy it required to maintain the fight. The settlement negotiations finally began 4 months after we'd filed the lawsuit, but they dragged on for another 6 weeks as Richard's attorneys tried to minimize his liability and our legal team pushed for comprehensive accountability. Every session revealed more about Richard's financial situation and his attempts to hide assets to avoid paying substantial settlements. Richard had been moving money into accounts under relatives' names, trying to make himself appear less wealthy than he actually was. He'd transferred property titles to his brother and mother to keep them out of the divorce settlement. He'd even claimed financial hardship despite evidence of substantial hidden wealth. Victoria's attorney and the forensic accountant working on her divorce case uncovered these schemes systematically. Every attempt Richard made to hide assets was documented and presented as evidence of his bad faith in negotiations. The discovery of financial fraud added to his legal and reputational problems beyond the harassment allegations. The final settlements were substantial but varied based on each woman's specific circumstances. My settlement included $250,000 in compensation for emotional distress and lost wages, plus Richard's written apology and agreement to notify any future fitness facilities about his history of harassment complaints. The money was less important than the public acknowledgement of wrongdoing and the permanent record that would follow Richard. The other women who'd been harassed received settlements ranging from $50,000 to $150,000 depending on the severity and duration of their experiences. Each settlement included Richard's admission that his behavior was inappropriate and unwanted, creating a permanent record that would protect future potential victims. Victoria's divorce settlement was the most substantial. She received the marital home valued at $3.2 million, 70% of retirement accounts and investments totaling approximately $8 million, and ongoing spousal support of $15,000 monthly. Richard's attempts to hide assets had backfired completely, as the discovery of financial fraud gave Victoria's attorneys leverage to demand and receive a disproportionate share of marital property. Elite Fitness settled separately, paying me $125,000 and agreeing to implement comprehensive anti-harassment policies, mandatory training for all staff on recognizing and responding to harassment complaints, and creation of an independent reporting system for employees who experienced client harassment. The settlement also required Elite Fitness to issue a public statement acknowledging their failure to protect me and committing to better practices. The total financial impact on Richard exceeded $12 million when all settlements, legal fees, and divorce asset division were calculated. But the reputational damage was equally devastating and permanent. His name would forever be associated with serial harassment rather than commercial real estate success. 6 months after Victoria's gym confrontation, I was in a dramatically different situation than immediately after losing my elite fitness job. The settlements had given me financial security I'd never had before. I'd saved and invested most of the money, using it to complete additional certifications and eventually open my own small personal training studio in Culver City. Santos Fitness was everything I'd wanted in a training environment. Small enough that I could control the culture completely, with clear anti-harassment policies and immediate consequences for any inappropriate client behavior. I could be selective about clients, accepting only people who respected professional boundaries and valued my expertise. And I could train without the constant background anxiety about powerful clients using their position to harass me. The studio succeeded beyond my expectations. Clients appreciated the professional environment and the clear boundaries. My reputation, once damaged by false accusations, had been rebuilt through the lawsuit's vindication and the public acknowledgement that I'd been a harassment victim rather than a homewrecker. Media coverage of the case had actually increased my visibility, and many clients specifically sought me out because they'd read about my experience and wanted to support my business. Within a year of opening Santos Fitness, I had a waiting list of clients and was considering hiring additional trainers to meet demand. The business was profitable enough that I could be selective about growth, choosing quality over expansion, maintaining the culture I'd created rather than scaling into something corporate. My relationship with Victoria evolved from strategic alliance to genuine friendship over this time. We met regularly even after the lawsuits and divorce were finalized, two women who'd been on opposite sides of harassment but found common ground in mutual transformation. Victoria often said our friendship was one of the few good things that came from the destruction of her marriage, a silver lining in an otherwise painful process. Victoria used her divorce settlement to fund the nonprofit she'd envisioned, calling it Voices Heard, an organization supporting harassment victims in service industry jobs. The organization provided legal consultations, connected victims with attorneys willing to take harassment cases, and offered financial assistance for people who lost jobs due to reporting harassment or refusing inappropriate advances. I served on Voices Heard's advisory board, helping develop programs and policies based on my own experience. We created a comprehensive guide for documenting workplace harassment, a network of attorneys specializing in these cases, and a support group for victims navigating the legal and emotional challenges of fighting back against powerful harassers. The organization's work was needed. As we built our resources and reputation, we were contacted by dozens of women in similar situations to mine. Young women working in restaurants, hotels, gyms, spas, and other service industries where wealthy clients felt entitled to pursue them inappropriately. Each story had unique details but familiar patterns. Persistent unwanted contact, pressure to engage privately, retaliation when they refused or reported, and often, blame from employers or others who assumed the women must have encouraged the attention. Voices Heard helped many of these women document harassment, file complaints, and pursue legal action when appropriate. We celebrated victories when harassers faced consequences and clients received settlements or policy changes. We supported people through defeats when employers or legal systems failed to protect them adequately. And we built a community of survivors who could support each other through experiences that often felt isolating and shameful. My involvement with Voices Heard became as important to my identity as my personal training career. Speaking about my experience publicly, helping other victims navigate similar situations, and seeing tangible results from our advocacy work gave deeper meaning to the trauma I'd experienced. Richard's harassment and Victoria's false accusation, which had seemed like pure harm at the time, became the foundation for helping protect others from similar abuse. I also became a frequent speaker at gyms and fitness conferences about creating safe workplaces and addressing client harassment. Many gym owners and managers simply hadn't thought carefully about how to protect trainers from inappropriate client behavior. They assumed professionalism and clear policies were sufficient without understanding the power dynamics that made reporting difficult and retaliation common. My presentations covered practical strategies. How to recognize the early warning signs of a client becoming inappropriately interested. How to set and maintain professional boundaries clearly. How to document concerning behavior from the first incident rather than waiting until it escalates. How to report harassment in ways that create a record even if immediate action isn't taken. And how to support employees who report harassment rather than prioritizing retention of wealthy clients. These presentations were well received because I spoke from direct experience rather than theory. I could describe exactly how Richard's behavior had progressed from mildly uncomfortable to clearly harassment. I could explain why I'd initially tried to handle it quietly rather than making a formal complaint immediately. I could articulate the fear of not being believed or being blamed that keeps many victims silent. And I could demonstrate how comprehensive documentation had been crucial for proving my case despite Richard's wealth and Elite Fitness's institutional failure. The fitness industry slowly began taking harassment more seriously as more trainers shared experiences and more gyms faced legal liability for failing to protect employees. Professional organizations developed better guidelines. Insurance companies required anti-harassment training. And a cultural shift began where blaming victims became less acceptable and holding harassers accountable became more expected. These changes came too late to protect me from Richard's harassment or prevent Victoria's humiliating accusation. But they helped protect the next generation of young trainers from experiencing what I'd endured. That knowledge made the difficult months of unemployment, financial stress, and legal battle feel worthwhile. My personal healing continued alongside professional success and advocacy work. Therapy helped me process the trauma and rebuild confidence that had been damaged by harassment and false accusations. Dr. Kim helped me recognize that being targeted by a predator said nothing about my worth or professionalism, that Richard had pursued me because I was vulnerable in my professional role rather than because I'd done anything to encourage his attention. This understanding was crucial for my emotional recovery. For months after the gym confrontation, I'd obsessed over whether I'd somehow invited Richard's harassment. Had I been too friendly during our training sessions? Had I sent mixed signals by being professionally attentive? Should I have been less warm, less engaged, less focused on providing excellent service? Dr. Kim helped me recognize this self-blame as a common trauma response that places responsibility on victims rather than perpetrators. Richard had harassed me because he was a predator who targeted young women in service positions, not because I'd done anything wrong or sent inappropriate signals. My professionalism and focus on client service were positive qualities that Richard had exploited, not flaws that had caused the harassment. Understanding this distinction allowed me to continue being warm and engaged with clients without fear that professionalism would be mistaken for personal interest. I could maintain the qualities that made me an excellent trainer without the constant anxiety that being good at my job would invite unwanted attention. Dating was complicated after everything that had happened with Richard. I'd been single throughout the harassment and lawsuit, too consumed by professional crisis and legal proceedings to think about relationships. When I eventually started dating again about 18 months after the gym confrontation, I found myself hypersensitive to any signs that men saw me as a sexual object rather than a whole person. I went on several first dates that ended poorly when men made comments about my appearance or physique that felt too close to Richard's inappropriate observations. I struggled with whether I was overreacting or appropriately protecting boundaries. Dr. Kim helped me understand that my heightened sensitivity was normal after trauma and that I didn't owe anyone the benefit of the doubt if their behavior made me uncomfortable. Eventually I met Carlos, a software engineer who'd hired me as a trainer at Santos Fitness and became a friend before we started dating. He understood professional boundaries from our trainer-client relationship. He respected my expertise and valued my intelligence alongside finding me attractive. And he listened when I explained my history with harassment and the resulting sensitivity to certain comments or behaviors. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully, with clear communication about boundaries and respect for each other's autonomy. It was healthy and genuine in ways that felt healing after years of navigating Richard's manipulation and the trauma that followed. 2 years after Victoria's gym confrontation, I was in a completely different place. Financially secure from settlements and successful business ownership. Professionally respected and sought after for training and speaking engagements. Personally healing through therapy, healthy relationships, and meaningful advocacy work. And emotionally at peace with how I'd handled an impossible situation and emerged stronger. The gym confrontation that had seemed like complete disaster had actually catalyzed positive change I couldn't have achieved otherwise. If Victoria hadn't confronted me publicly, I might have continued trying to handle Richard's harassment quietly. If I hadn't lost my elite fitness job, I might never have found the courage to sue and expose his pattern of predatory behavior. If the lawsuit hadn't succeeded so completely, other victims might never have come forward or received justice. Sometimes the worst moments create opportunities for the best outcomes. Victoria's false accusation hurt deeply and damaged my reputation temporarily. But it also forced both of us to confront truths we'd been avoiding and ultimately led to Richard facing accountability he'd evaded for decades. I still have difficult moments. Anxiety sometimes surfaces when powerful wealthy men become clients, even though I now have systems to protect myself that didn't exist at Elite Fitness. Anger occasionally flares when I hear about harassment victims being blamed or not believed. Sadness hits when I think about the months of unemployment and financial stress that resulted from being a harassment victim. But these moments are balanced by satisfaction, purpose, and genuine joy. Satisfaction that Richard Lawrence lost everything he'd spent decades building through predatory behavior. Purpose in helping other victims avoid or escape similar situations. Joy in running a business I love, in relationships built on mutual respect, and in knowing I contributed to making the fitness industry slightly safer for the next generation of trainers. Victoria's dramatic gym confrontation, humiliating as it was in the moment, ultimately became the catalyst for justice, transformation, and meaningful change. The personal trainer accused of being a homewrecker became the advocate protecting others from harassment. The wife who'd blindly believed her husband's lies became the ally supporting victims and exposing predators. And the powerful man who'd spent decades harassing young women learned that wealth and position can't protect you forever when victims refuse to stay silent and document everything comprehensively. That's the real lesson of this story. Power and money seem untouchable until victims find courage to speak, document thoroughly, and persist despite obstacles. Richard Lawrence thought he was untouchable because he was wealthy and well-connected. Elite Fitness thought they could ignore harassment complaints because wealthy clients were more valuable than employee safety. Victoria thought attacking me would protect her marriage because blaming the other woman was easier than confronting her husband's predatory behavior. All of them were wrong. And their wrongness cost Richard his reputation and fortune, cost Elite Fitness substantial settlements and policy changes, and cost Victoria her marriage but gave her the opportunity to rebuild her identity with integrity. The young Filipina personal trainer they all underestimated ended up destroying a predator's reputation, exposing institutional failures, and building a successful business and advocacy organization from the ashes of her humiliation. That's justice. That's accountability. And that's why I continue telling this story to anyone who will listen. If you've experienced harassment and been blamed for it, if you've been called a homewrecker for rejecting someone's advances, if you've watched powerful people avoid consequences while their victims are labeled as troublemakers, remember that documentation is power and persistence is victory. Screenshot every inappropriate message. Record every concerning conversation if legal in your jurisdiction. Identify every witness who saw problematic behavior. File formal complaints even if you don't expect immediate action because creating a paper trail is crucial for future legal action. And most importantly, don't stay silent to protect powerful people's reputations or avoid being labeled as difficult. The cost of silence is borne entirely by victims while harassers continue harming others. The cost of speaking is often substantial and painful in the short term, but the long-term benefits of accountability and justice make that cost worthwhile. Richard Lawrence harassed me for months and then convinced his wife to destroy my reputation publicly. He thought he was powerful enough to avoid consequences through lies and manipulation. Instead, he lost everything because I refused to stay silent, documented his behavior comprehensively, and found an unexpected ally in the wife he'd been lying to for decades. The personal trainer he harassed ended up financially secure and professionally successful. The wife he manipulated ended up divorced and dedicated to supporting harassment victims. And the powerful predator ended up exposed, disgraced, and alone. That's what happens when victims refuse to accept blame for predators' behavior, when allies choose truth over comfortable lies, and when comprehensive documentation overcomes wealth and power. Richard Lawrence learned this lesson too late. But perhaps other would-be harassers, reading this story or hearing about this case, will learn it early enough to change their behavior before victims document enough evidence to destroy them completely. Hit subscribe. Share this story. Support harassment victims. Believe women when they report inappropriate behavior. And remember that the most dangerous harassers aren't the obvious predators but the charming wealthy ones who think their money and position make them untouchable. Until they encounter a victim who documents everything, finds powerful allies, and refuses to stay silent regardless of the cost. Then they discover that money can't buy protection from truth, power can't prevent accountability, and reputation can't survive comprehensive evidence of predatory behavior exposed publicly and permanently.